What's up, everybody? So I've read and I've seen videos about us living now in this modern era of horsepower, or this modern golden era of horsepower. But when I read that, or when I hear somebody say that, I just kind of shake my head. See, I would argue that we live in the last breath of the horsepower era. And see, here's the reason why I say that. Back in the 60s, there were so many different choices that you had in terms of an American muscle car or an American pony car to choose from. And the list goes on, but you could talk about GTOs, Challengers, Camaros. You could talk about the big block Mustangs. You could talk about any list of cars you want to come up with and probably not scratch the surface right off the top of your head. Whereas today, the variety just is not there. Now, granted, the engines do make more horsepower, but I would argue that number one, they don't make near the torque that they did back then. And number two, you don't have near the variety of power plants today that they did back then. Car culture was just something completely different. The car was embraced in a different way back then. And it shows in the market that they sold in back then. Again, the variety and just the sheer number of cars that were out there and that were performance oriented just far and away eclipses what we see today. Let's take a look at just the cost alone of those cars, dollar for dollar back then versus today. The average income for, the average salary anyway, from what I could tell from the late 60s, was around $5,000 a year. And if you compare that to the average salary of 2016, you're looking at about $50,000 a year. The cars back then averaged somewhere around $3,000, $3,500, whereas today you're looking at $35,000 just more or less as an entry level. Basically, the cost of getting into the club for having one of these, muscle cars or a pony car, sports car, or whatever you want to call them, if it's got an American badge on the side of it. So again, if you look at that alone, you'll see that the cars just cost more dollar for dollar. But then today also too, you have more entertainment choices. You've got the internet, which is a bill in and of itself. You've got cell phone bills, you've got cable bills. So you have all these other bills today that people pay, and that takes a bite out of your income as well. So the ability to afford a car like this is just that much tougher to attain. But the main thing is that it's really back to that car culture thing. It just does not exist today that it did back then, so the market doesn't bear the same types of cars. Here's something else to consider too. Guys back then that were considered car guys or gear heads would typically work on their own cars. I mean, everybody had a buddy that could rebuild a Rochester carburetor in their sleep, or the guys that were really good with working on the cars that today just are more interested in doing other things, which is a real shame. Because if you were brought up in a car culture or a family that was big into the cars of the day, that car was more or less a member of the family, so to speak. Whereas it's just a form of it's just not a form of entertainment. It's just a form of transportation. Basically, it's just a transportation appliance. And again, the market shows that. In fact, if you look at just the engine choices that you have in cars today, it's nowhere. It didn't even come close to what it was back in the 60s. I'll give you an idea. The Mustang, if you want a V8, you get one of two V8s. You get the 5-liter or the 5.2 and the GT350. The Camaro, as of 2016, you only get one. Their only other foray into another V8 would have been the 427, or at least in the ZL1, you get the supercharged car. But I want to stay away from those cars for the sake of this conversation because, again, that's not a car that the average guy can just go out and afford if you're making an average salary of $50,000 a year. So when you look at which manufacturers are at least following that, that American muscle car, or at least following in line with, the car culture, the only one that does it really is Dodge. And that's with the 5.7 Hemi as an intro V8. And you can also get the 392. So again, manufacturers limit your selections even that much more still. Whereas back in the 60s, you could get any list of engines in a Chevelle, and you could get a 350, and there are a couple of different 350s you could get. You could get a 396, and the list goes on and on. And every manufacturer offered those same choices that you just don't see today. So it's in the packaging as well. Options on the car too, because car culture really isn't quite what it used to be. You can't. Back then, you could option different rear gear ratios. You could option, in some cases, performance packs with your cars then that you just can't get now. So yes, the base horsepower might be more, 435 in that Mustang, 455 the Camaro, and just south of 500 with these 392s, or just south of 400 with the 5.7 Hemis. But you just don't get the variety that you used to have. You don't get the embrace of the car culture that you used to have back then. Here's something else to consider, though: the tuning part of it, the guys getting together to work on cars together just doesn't really exist anymore. There's other things for people that are in the hobby to do that don't involve having to work on the cars. Some might say that's a great thing. With computer technology, you don't have to tune a carburetor. You don't have to have that buddy that can rebuild a Rochester in his sleep anymore. Now you just get in the car, start it, and go on. But in a way, if you are a hobbyist, the problem is that you've kind of taken some of that away from it. You've taken some of the fun. You've taken a little bit of that challenge. And I would argue you've taken a bit of that personality away from the car. And again, with other entertainment options that are available, let's be honest, kids today, and when I say kids, I mean, somewhere, somebody just south of 25, just they've got better things to do than tinker with a car. And that's if they can afford to, have a garage and have the tools and have everything that it would take to actually work on the thing themselves, much less have friends that are into it too. Those are kind of a rare breed these days. But at any rate, that's kind of my take on this whole golden era of, horsepower and all of that. Yeah, the horsepower is a little bit more these days, but the reality is that you're so limited in your choices, and you're so limited by what not only you can get from the manufacturers in terms of options and optional, go fast parts that you used to be able to get back in the day. You're limited by that, but you're also limited by the fact that the car culture itself is more or less diminished down to, an American muscle car fleet that really only has, 3 or 4 options available to you. But let me know what you think. Let me get your ideas on, do we live in a golden age of horsepower? And where do you think that this age is leading us to? Is the V8 going to be dead in a few years? I know the 392 is slated to be gone. What do you think the future of the 5-liter is, or the 6.2? Do you think everything's going to be running around with turbos and 6 cylinders? Let me know what you think. Post up your comments. Adios.